Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I wanted to talk some about Robert E. Howard's most immortal creation, Conan the Barbarian, who originally appeared in the pulp era, most often on the pages of Weird Tales magazine in the 1930s. Howard was a master writer who essentially birthed what came to be known as the sword and sorcery genre, and Conan is by no means his only character. He had many characters before, during, and even after he was writing the Conan stories, of which he wrote just over 20 or so before his tragic death by suicide. But he also was playing around with other concepts and refining things with Conan that he had done in past characters such as King Cole of Atlantis. So it's interesting to look at Howard's prolific output when he was actually writing stories before his death, but also how they all inform upon one another. And in doing so, it does make it feel as if it is a sort of shared literary universe, which it's now really, I think, recognized as. Now, I myself am not really a fantasy person in terms of fantasy is not the type of genre that I'm really into, and so I knew of Conan the Barbarian primarily from the 1982 John Milius film, and of course its 1984 sequel, Conan the Destroyer. And that is not really the Conan of Howard's stories. What's fascinating about Howard's character and what you get just immediately right off the bat is how intelligent and realistic he is. He is a heroic character, of course, living in the Hyborian age and is from Cimmeria, so he is seen as a outsider, barbarian character, a savage, if you will, by practically all others in the stories. But the irony is, and what the readers sort of clued on immediately, is that frequently, if not always, Conan, with his so-called savage ways, is actually more honorable, more chivalrous, and more wise than all of the supposedly more highly minded, sophisticated, intelligent people and other entities that he comes into contact with. That's the real hook in terms of the reader getting into the character. And the stories themselves, fascinatingly, jump all around the storyline of the character. They do not run chronologically. Each story is an individual event within the lifespan of Conan of Cimmeria. Some he is a young thief, some he is a battle-hardened warrior or general, and some, of course, he is the king of Aquilonia, which he gained by his own hand. But because the stories jump around, you don't necessarily have the hows or whys. It makes the character and the events of each story feel more mythical, and thus, in a way, by keeping the reader a bit in the dark as to how they got to this particular point, it gives the stories even greater weight and leans back into this idea that they themselves are myths that are being told and passed down from generation to generation. That makes the character's core traits of a certain kind of chivalry, a certain kind of honor, and a certain kind of wisdom gained through life experiences all the more important, because that is what the reader can latch onto and thus be able to go with this character and, read one story where he may be in his 20s and then read one story where he may be in his 50s or 60s, and be able to jump around and have different types of stories and different tones, but all with the sort of unifying core theme all centered around what we like about the character. And Conan is a very likable character, and while the barbarian is obviously in the name, and the stories do frequently have a body count, one also has to keep in mind that they were written for the audience of the pulp magazines, so you certainly have to have the pulpiness of there being beautiful women to rescue, who are, of course, very scantily clad or naked, all kinds of monsters and demons and elements of magic and sorcerers, and also giant beasts to slay and big battle scenes and massive body counts if the story calls for it. But that's the key phrase. Everything that's in the stories is called for by the specific story. It isn't about just overdoing it on the blood and guts without having intelligent thought behind it. And again, what Howard was doing here in his Conan stories and really all of his fiction is setting the groundwork for what was to come in sword and sorcery. So that is why he is looked at as the father of the sword and sorcery genre, and it's all here on the page if you read the Conan stories for the first time. The stories themselves follow basically the same themes as what I've already discussed, but nicely they differentiate themselves in the types of stories, along with being from completely random points in Conan's life. So what Howard does in each story, while they all build upon one another, and he grows more confident in writing the character as he goes along, they nicely all fit together as a whole. And because each one's a little bit different, it makes each one feel fresh when you're reading them. So they don't start to bog down and feeling the same. You will notice certain stories repeat certain elements, and in his one novel, he was basically pulling ideas from 2 or 3 pre-existing stories, and that's why I think those very clearly echo there. But that's natural for any writer, I think, to do that somewhat when writing the same character over and over and over again. But I do think that in looking at the structure of the novel compared to the short stories, I think the character and the fact that these were being written for the pulp magazine audience, like Johnston McCulley's Zorro stories, I think Conan is better suited to the shorter or even the slightly longer story as opposed to what Howard did in his novel. But again, he only wrote one Conan novel, so it's quite possible had he lived longer and decided to write more Conan stories that he might have done something different in a different novel. But it's interesting to compare the structure of the shortest short stories, the slightly longer ones, the expanded ones, and then compare all of those to the one novel. But all of this is one thing. The other is, I think, the most shocking experience of reading the Conan stories for the first time. And I certainly went through this as I was devouring these lovely Del Rey editions. For me, as someone who's not a fantasy reader, I had only known of Conan from the films, and I had a basic idea of who Howard was and what the stories were written for in terms of the pulp readership of the 1930s. But that doesn't prepare you for actually reading Howard's text for the first time because, and I'm obviously not the first to say this, there are many fantastic Howard experts out there who can explain it much better than I, and also many great channels here on YouTube who are experts in the world of Robert E. Howard who have done some really excellent videos. But for those who don't know, Howard could write like a dream. His prose is just majestic. It is not the sort of typical pulp magazine prose in terms of most writers were just cranking out stories and getting paid by the word, and also on extreme deadlines. So that meant great care in trying to make your stories literary and have fancy prose. Those were usually the last thing on people's minds. Or significantly curtailed. But Howard was writing basically exactly what he wanted, and outside of having to make trims and cuts for the size and dimensions of pulp magazines, or having his text be slightly tweaked and edited by the magazine editors, Howard was writing for the ages. I mean, his prose is just beautiful. And that's what made me go, where have these been all my life? And why I then had to devour all 3 complete volumes of the Conan stories, because I simply couldn't believe how just beautiful his prose was, whether he's describing action or Conan's moods or the setting of his mythical Hyborian age that's also fascinatingly pulling elements out of certain aspects of human history to give it some recognizable factors that someone influenced the 1982 film to do a similar thing. But his prose, it just lives and breathes. You could flip to practically any page of a Howard Conan story and just read a random passage, and it would belong in a literature class. Howard should be studied as one of the great American writers. The Conan stories, along with the rest of his body of work, belong in literature courses, even in high school literature courses or English classes, because it is that exquisite. It is just exquisite prose. It is storytelling for the ages. And that, I think, is what has made the stories so influential and far-ranging, even though they were originally ostensibly just written for a pulp audience. The best of the pulp writers were great writers who were not talking down to the reader and were able to work around the constraints of the magazine format and extreme schedule to produce works of art. And Howard is one of, if not arguably the most notable example. The Conan stories are so vividly realized that they seem to have just been birthed fully formed from Howard's fingers, writing and typing the stories. They are just so vivid to read that you can just sit there and you picture and you visualize every single element from the most mundane to the most fantastical. And because the stories themselves are so varied, they start to feel even more real. Reading a Conan story in some ways is like having a literary fever dream where you are just so completely invested in the text and you're able to visualize every last element of them that they feel alive. They live and breathe. The prose lives and breathes. There's nothing quite like Howard's storytelling and his prose. There really isn't. And with Conan, it is the character that obviously became the most popular, and Howard had to spend the most time and focus on, while also pulling from other characters that he was either working on at the time or he had previously created. So you can see, if you look at Howard's other works and you read all the wonderful extra materials in these Del Rey editions, or do some research on Howard's other works, you can see how they all sort of influence one another, but Conan is obviously the standout character because he was even in the pulp magazine era, and I think Howard must have recognized that he had achieved something special that was unique with Conan as opposed to his other characters. But again, all his characters are fascinating. But what's great about reading Howard now is we have these beautiful editions from Del Rey that are part of their authorized Howard collection. Now, Del Rey did not publish all of Howard's work, but they did do most of it in these beautiful trade paperback editions. Now, sometimes I've seen these are available in hardcover editions, but these are what you find in print everywhere. They are absurdly cheap for the value that you get, and these are so well done that I would put them on my short list of amazing, worth its weight in gold literary editions that everybody can afford, so everybody should have. I got to come up with a shorter, more concise name, but these are that astounding. So the Conan stories are split between 3 volumes. Volume 1, entitled The Coming of Conan, has the first 13 of the Conan stories in the actual order Howard wrote them. And of course, this has a lovely design that is used on all the Howard editions that Del Rey did. So they all have the same aesthetic, the same size, and they all nicely fit on the shelf. What is astounding about these is just how cheap they are. This is only $18 list price, and frequently these go on sale for even less. And each volume is about usually 400 to 500, maybe even 600 pages, depending on the thickness. So you're definitely getting your money's worth. But this, again, has the first 3 of the stories, and they are all beautifully illustrated. So this has some of the all-time classic Conan stories included, and every story is beautifully illustrated in this volume by Mark Schultz, and the actual layout, text, design, everything is very nice and easy on the eyes. And also, for so many pages, due to them breaking up the volumes into 3, it's actually relatively easy to hold in your hand. So this is a really attractive volume, but also one that is very easy to carry around with you, to come back to a lot. It's rather durable. Of course, it would be nice if they weren't paperbacks in terms of overall durability, but I have to say, I'm just so impressed by these, and the actual printing is, of course, gorgeous. Most of the illustrations are smaller and within the page, like this one, but then you also have some beautiful full-page paintings inserted. And while everything is in black and white, I really like that uniform quality, and it does actually fit, I think, with the text extremely well, because you'll just get this beautiful artwork scattered throughout, and the overall font and layout and everything is just beautiful. But of course, you also get loads of supplements in each volume from various Howard experts and historians. These also have introductions and pieces by the artists for each volume, and the actual text themselves. You are given a full section at the end about basically giving you the full notes on each text and what text was used. And what is crucial about these is you are actually getting Howard's full intent, because they did not use edited text or texts that were tweaked or changed by others, or the original pulp magazine text. Every text in the Del Rey edition is using the original uncut story, basically directly with Howard's original notes and everything, and you are given all that information at the back of each volume. Volume 2 is a little bit slimmer in terms of page count, and that is because The Bloody Crown of Conan is actually bringing together 3 of the long-form stories. Both The People of the Black Circle and A Witch Shall Be Born are longer stories, but it is The Hour of the Dragon that is the one full Conan novel. So this is basically bringing together the 3 stories that themselves could be considered obviously longer than the short stories, but also novels in and of themselves. But really, Hour of the Dragon is the one that is significantly long and itself is novel length, while the other 2, but I don't know if I myself would call them full novels. But it's nice to have all 3 of these together here to study for themselves and sort of separate them from the short stories. So it makes sense why they broke these 3 up into their own volume and also filled it with the same beautiful style. So there is full artwork throughout the entirety of the book. The artist this time is Gary Gianni. We have the lovely supplements, we have a foreword, we have artist notes, and then we have the stories themselves with the same beautiful, lovely style, the same gorgeous font and layout, and the fantastic artwork that, again, while in black and white, really suits the stories. And there are, of course, also some full-page pieces in as well. Then we conclude with not only more notes about the text and additional supplement pieces, but they also broke up some of Howard's other Conan writings and his drafts and synopses that were in his archives. Those are also included in these 3 volumes. So the actual end of the book is significantly long after the 3 stories. You basically have about 65 to 70 pages of additional supplements and notes. Then the 3rd volume is The Conquering Sword of Conan. This brings together the final 5 stories plus a ton of additional material from Howard's archive, and of course also wonderful pieces by historians and experts. So this completes the set in the same lovely style. So obviously it's a little bit thicker than the 2nd volume, still with gorgeous artwork. This time the artist is Gregory Manchess, and we have the same lovely layout with the introduction pieces and then the whole listing of contents throughout. And then we jump right into the remaining 5 stories. But what's fantastic about this, not only does it have some of the most iconic Conan stories with fantastic artwork, but this has an enormous supplemental section, because this includes all kinds of Howard pieces after the conclusion of Red Nails, which is one of the most iconic Conan stories and one of Howard's masterpieces. But then we go into this supplemental section, which has multiple drafts of some of the stories that were in this collection, or also synopses that Howard wrote, and it really gives you insight into his whole working process. And while some of these are short and some of these are synopsis A, synopsis B, you're able to see Howard's writing process and his thinking process as he's going through stuff, and also submitting stories and getting back the feedback and working on developing further elements or tweaking things from past stories that maybe he wants to do differently. And then there's even an entire draft of Red Nails itself. So this is just a real treasure to dive into after reading these stories. And it's a gigantic portion of this is just also for delving further into Howard's artistry as a writer. But of course, you have a book filled with beautiful, fantastical imagery like this, so what's not to love? And astoundingly, they did all this, and all 3 of these volumes are at the same low list price, and they all beautifully match and go together on the shelf, and I think are essential even if you're like me and you never thought you'd be reading fantasy fiction or sword and sorcery novels. It's best to start by going to the source. But again, Howard's prose transcends genre, really. So, of course, I would recommend Howard's Conan stories to anyone. They are just they are simply magical. And his grasp of writing prose fiction, he was a master in his craft. That is just apparent from any of these stories. But these Del Rey editions are not only incredible values, but they are beautifully done and feature so much in terms of supplemental material and giving you Howard's uncut original stories. So basically giving you the full vision of each story and having a really lovely design and layout to be able to read through all of Howard's Conan stories in one sort of overall collection of 3 volumes. I think it's one of the absolute all-time great values or best values in modern books in terms of releases of great literature. And I really do want to get all of the other Del Rey volumes. Thankfully, if you're interested in further Howard releases, the Howard Estate actually has their own press, and they are doing some of the more obscure Robert E. Howard stories and characters, plus some of the other wonderful pulp reprint publishers have done some of Howard's other tales. So at least there is plenty of Howard's work out there now, which wasn't exactly the case many years ago for quite some time. It was really these Del Rey editions coming out in the mid-2000s that I think firmly turned that around in terms of what's generally available to the public. And so these remain not only incredible values, but I think absolute musts for anyone's book collection, because the stories themselves are iconic. They are so beautifully written that you can return to them time and time again. And these Del Rey editions are so inexpensive and impressively made and stuffed with beautiful, incredible artwork and other pieces for historical context and further study that I just think they're essential. They are incredible books of incredible, iconic pieces of American literature. So again, these have just been my thoughts on reading Robert E. Howard's Conan stories for the first time and diving into these incredible Del Rey editions, which I think belong on anyone's bookshelf. Even if you're not into fantasy fiction or sword and sorcery genre titles, all you have to do is read the first volume. In fact, I would encourage anyone to at least try out Robert E. Howard by reading the Del Rey Coming of Conan first volume with the first 13 short stories and plenty of extra pieces and beautiful artwork. If any of the stories in that first volume don't grab you, then I don't know if you have a pulse. Because it basically grabs you from the get-go. And for me, probably still my favorite of the 3 volumes and my favorite of the stories are actually the earlier ones, because they are a bit more two-fisted, adventurous, and I think maybe there is a little spark of it being the first stories and writing directly for the pulp magazines. But also this was my first experience reading Conan. All I knew before this was some of the Marvel comic stories and mostly the film. I knew the Howard Conan was dramatically different, and frankly, no one's ever truly adapted Howard's Conan, because this character is an absolute original. It's hugely influential on everything that has come afterwards, but in terms of what we've seen in other media, outside of some of the comics directly adapting some of Howard's stories and some of Howard being reflected in the films, no one's ever really done Conan as Howard wrote him, who is just a fascinating, completely original character who is so endearing to the reader from the get-go that you would simply follow the adventures of this character practically anywhere. And as much as I love the 1982 film, and as much of Howard's spirit that film actually manages to have, it's not Howard's Conan. It is its own thing. It tells an origin story, which Howard's Conan never has, and that's actually part of his appeal, that we don't know absolutely everything about this character. There is an element of mystery that keeps the reader interested. So I think it would be fascinating for someone to actually try and make a legitimate Howard Conan film adaptation. But for those who think you know the character simply because you know the films or some of the comics, well, you really have to read Howard's stories. Again, I would stress that I think everyone should at least read The Coming of Conan, and then if that grabs you, as it most likely will, then you'll want to dive into the other two volumes. And again, these volumes are so beautifully made that it's great to be able to read Howard's texts the way they were intended to be read, uncut, without anybody else tampering with them, and get beautiful extra pieces and artwork to go along with them. So I'm actually glad I didn't try and read these years and years ago before these Del Rey editions existed in the mid 2000s, and they are still in print. So again, if any of this sounds remotely interesting or you haven't looked at these, I would strongly recommend it, because I think they're incredible values, and they're not expensive themselves. They're, again, only $18 list price, and frequently are on sale for $15, or and other volumes are even less. So you can actually collect the whole series line and not spend too terribly much. So as always, I hope my babbles about books and printed fiction and the magic of pulp fiction has been at least somewhat fun and informative. I am by no means a Howard expert. This is really my first sort of foray into the world of Robert E. Howard, who I had known of but not really read much of, because I knew his works were primarily what birthed the sword and sorcery genre, which typically isn't my preferred genre. I'm much more of a realistic fiction person in terms of that's what I prefer to read. But I mean, Howard's texts are just so magical and so immediately arresting that from the first story, I was just immediately transported into another world and saying, where has this been all my life? So if you're like me and you've never read the Conan stories before, you definitely should. And these Del Rey editions are they are a bargain. They are one of the bargains of books in 2024, even though these came out in 2003, 2004, 2005. They're still in print. They belong on anyone's bookshelf, and you certainly get an incredible amount for not very much money, and they contain some of the most iconic works of the genre that they essentially founded. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some Del Rey Howard editions if you haven't already. Keep reading print books, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.